Welcome back now for the news in detail. We start with the United States, which says it wants New Delhi to quickly lift restrictions in Indian-occupied Kashmir. State Department South Asia official Alice Wells has also asked New Delhi to release detained political leaders. Talking to reporters in Washington, Wells called on the Indian government to resume political engagement with the Kashmiri leaders. She said the United States is concerned over widespread imprisonment of politicians and businessmen. Wells said the world will benefit from reduced tensions and increased dialogue between Pakistan and India. She also said, considering the escalating situation, US President Donald Trump is willing to mediate if asked by both the parties. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan will address the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly today. In his speech, he will highlight the worsening human rights situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir under New Delhi's lockdown. Khan will also hold a meeting with the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on the sidelines. Earlier, speaking at the dialogue on financing for development, Khan called for a closure of tax havens. He called for effective measures to combat money laundering, corruption and tax evasion. He said these sanctuaries of ill-gotten money are devastating developing countries across the world. Khan shared Pakistan's government's efforts to alleviate poverty, rein in corruption and money laundering. Pakistan has boycotted the opening statement of Indian External Affairs Minister Subrahmanyam Jaishankar at the SAARC meeting in New York. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Pakistan will not engage with the butchers of Kashmir until and unless India lifts its siege of occupied Kashmir. Meanwhile, Pakistan says it is ready to host the 19th summit of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation in Islamabad. Speaking after the ministerial meeting, Qureshi said a date for the summit will be proposed soon. Qureshi also said India had objected to the proposal last year but remained silent this year. He said no member countries have objected to the summit being held in Islamabad. Pakistan has marked Kashmir Solidarity Day today to express support for the people in Indian-occupied Kashmir. The Interior Ministry issued a theme, "Let us save the innocent children of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir." Rallies were held across the country to express support for the people of the occupied valley. Kashmiris are facing scarcity of basic essentials and particular life-saving drugs. Meanwhile, the Afghan government has deployed more than 100,000 troops to guard polling stations for Saturday's presidential elections. The measure was taken after the Taliban said they will block all roads on polling day and attack all election-related activity. One of the 18 contesting candidates, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, has also threatened violence if the government rigs elections. Former MP for Faryab, Bashir Ahmed Tayanj, says majority districts will not be safe enough for voting. He ruled out polling in at least 20 districts across Maidan Vardak, Ghazni, Faryab and Nuristan province. Meanwhile, government forces and the Taliban have claimed killing each other's troops in various encounters. The people of Afghanistan will be going to the polls on Saturday. They will be able to choose between the 6 candidates who have emerged on the mainstream political scene, which reflects the division in the electorate as a whole. More details in this report.
According to Afghan Independent Electoral Commission, some 9.6 million registered voters across the country will be eligible to cast their votes. The election was originally scheduled for April but has been frequently delayed by security, economic and political issues at home and abroad. The domestic security situation in the country has further deteriorated since the suspension of peace talks between the US and the Taliban.
The biggest problem for Afghanistan is safety. Every day, different people come to my shop and complain to me that it's not safe out there. If we don't have a safe environment, we have no business to do.
Many Afghans fear these elections won't do the country much good either. Merchants are disappointed about the slow development of urban infrastructure and business opportunities. People don't seem satisfied with President Ashraf Ghani's tenure and are pessimistic that a lot won't change unless the security situation improves. Therefore, voter turnout is expected to be fairly low.
I'm not going to vote this time because there are no viable candidates. Last time I voted, but the result was not satisfactory. I haven't seen much change in the last 5 years.
For all the mixed opinions, the security situation in Afghanistan remains the most pressing concern for the population.
Now, for more on this, we are joined by Mr. James Dorsey, Singapore-based political analyst. Thank you very much for your time. So, Mr. Dorsey, the Taliban have recently threatened to jeopardize Saturday's elections. So, how serious is this threat?
I would take the threat very serious. Yes, we've seen a number of attacks already, particularly since the breakdown in negotiations when U.S. President Trump canceled a meeting with Taliban leaders, and the Taliban have made very clear that negotiations with the United States is not reason enough to bring a halt, at least even temporarily, to their armed endeavors.
Right, Mr. Dorsey, in the current circumstances, when we've seen so many recent attacks by the Taliban, what are the chances of the Afghan government defeating the threat and winning the confidence of voters to persuade them to come out and cast their ballot?
I think it's a very fragile situation, and turnout is going to be very important in terms of the legitimacy of the government in these elections. Problem, of course, is you're talking about elections in a country in which the government does not have total control over all of its territory. And therefore, by definition already, there is a question mark of how representative the government is.
Right, Mr. Dorsey. So what do you think will be the effect of the 2019 elections on Afghanistan? And do you think it will be negative, or you think this can help the country? And what do you think will be the future of Ashraf Ghani?
Well, I think there are various layers here. First of all, if they pull off the elections on Saturday reasonably well, then of course that will be seen as a success for the government, whoever heads it after that, and the Afghan government backers, particularly the United States, will project that as a success. The election in itself, really, what it matters will only depend on how the solution to the Afghan conflict is constructed. So up until now, we've really had a situation in which the United States was talking about the withdrawal of U.S. forces with the Taliban, and those negotiations focused primarily on two issues: a timetable for the U.S. withdrawal and Taliban commitments that they would not engage in transnational political violence. That's a problem for the government, because if by not including the government in these negotiations, obviously the United States is sending a signal, and that raises questions for the future of whoever is going to be president, whether that's Ashraf Ghani or someone else.
Right, Mr. James Dorsey, thank you for joining us live on Indus News. Now, moving on, the US has announced the deployment of 200 troops for Sentinel radar systems and Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia. The Pentagon says the arrangement will bolster Riyadh's defense of critical military and civilian infrastructure. In a statement, the US military said it is putting additional capabilities on prepare to deploy orders. 2 more Patriot batteries and a missile defense system will be prepared to go in case of a crisis. The move comes in the aftermath of the September 14th attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. Saudi Arabia has called for global action against Iran, accusing it of the recent attacks on Riyadh's oil facilities. In his speech at the UN General Assembly, Saudi Foreign Minister Ibrahim bin Abdul Aziz Al Assaf called the strike a real test of the international community's will. He said Iran has jeopardized world energy supplies as well as international peace and the global economy. Assaf said Tehran's sources of finance should be cut off until it re-announces its ballistic missile program. The foreign minister said the kingdom has never promoted war, but will defend its holy site and sovereignty. Meanwhile, at a press conference in New York, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran had nothing to do with the attacks. Moving on, Turkey says it will continue its trade with Iran despite the threat of United States sanctions. President Tayyip Erdogan said it is impossible for Ankara to stop buying oil and gas from Tehran. Speaking in Ankara, Erdogan said his country does not want to sever its cooperation with Tehran. Earlier, Erdogan cautioned against blaming Iran for the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. He said it will be inappropriate to put the entire burden on Tehran without sufficient evidence. The British-flagged Sino Imperial oil tanker has left the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas and began its journey home. The vessel was detained by Iran's Revolutionary Guard in the Strait of Hormuz for alleged marine violations in July. Tracking data shows the Sino has set a new destination for UAE's Port Rashid in Dubai. Iranian authorities accused the Sino Imperial of failing to observe international maritime law at the time of its seizure. The Imperial was held after Britain seized an Iranian tanker off the territory of Gibraltar. Meanwhile, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas took the opportunity to dive right into Israel's ongoing political jockeying. Now, speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, Abbas said he will not see to an emboldened Israeli stint. The Palestinian leader called for the UN to be a mediator in peace talks between Palestine and Israel, adding Palestine will not accept sole US mediation. President Abbas also came out against stances backed by the Trump administration, saying they run the risk of hardening divisions. He added Palestine remains committed to a two-state solution. He said recent developments, including the U.S. decision to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, have jeopardized a future two-state solution.
A week before the recent Israeli elections, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to arrogantly announce that should he prevail in the elections, he would annex and apply Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, Northern Dead Sea, and Israel's colonial settlements, despite the fact that all these areas are occupied Palestinian territory. We reject entirely and completely this plan.
Meanwhile, in Egypt, nearly 2,000 protesters have been arrested as calls for President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's resignations intensify. The government has begun rounding up prominent opposition leaders ahead of mass protests planned after Friday prayers today. This week, thousands have taken part in demonstrations across the country in defiance of a 2013 ban. Prosecutors in a statement said security forces arrested some foreign nationals in Cairo, including a Palestinian and a Dutch national. The demonstrations were called by self-exiled Egyptian businessman Muhammad Ali, who accuses el-Sisi of corruption. El-Sisi has dismissed the allegations. More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, the European Union says Britain will be responsible if the talks for a Brexit deal fail. In an interview, EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said the bloc is doing all it can to avoid a no deal. Juncker said he and Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier are working intensively for an agreement. He said it will be catastrophic for Britain and the bloc if the UK left without a proper withdrawal. Earlier in Brussels, MEP Guy Verhofstadt and Barnier expressed dismay at the UK's bids for a new deal. Verhofstadt said Britain's proposals for Brexit deal fell short. Now, Japan has raised its threat level for both China and North Korea. An annual defense paper approved by the cabinet today underscores the country's fear of being targeted by its neighbors. The paper points to North Korea's development of miniature ballistic warheads and the absence of any concrete steps on denuclearization. It said Pyongyang is now trying to increase missile ranges, accuracy and surprise attack capability. The defense report also noted China's threat is expanding into space from regional seas and says Tokyo must prioritize space security. Russia has detained 3 North Korean fishing vessels and 262 crew members. Border guards say the vessels were poaching in waters that Moscow considers its exclusive economic zone. Officials have delivered the vessels to the port of Nakhodka. Border guards seized 30,000 squid as well as illegal fishing equipment. Earlier this month, Russia detained 2 North Korean boats in its territorial waters in the Sea of Japan. Russia said one of the vessels attacked its patrol, injuring 2 border guards. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of students have gathered across New Zealand for a second global school strike for climate action. The latest round of protests built on last week's marches by millions of children around the world. The organizers of School Strike for Climate reported 170,000 people protested nationwide. Students delivered a petition to Parliament calling on the government to declare a climate emergency. The strike is planned to roll through Asia and Europe before culminating in a rally in Montreal, Canada. Teenage activist Greta Thunberg is scheduled to speak to the rally. In Chile and Panama, local communities are trying to improve their management of plastic waste. Numerous recycling initiatives and education programs on plastic waste management are currently underway in both the countries. This report has more details.
Chile is one of Latin America's top garbage generators. Every year, the country generates nearly 1 million tons of plastic and recycles only 8.5%. 3 years earlier, several Latin American countries passed a law that promotes recycling.
The way we have tried to make that change is through the development of a system that allows companies to understand that what they have in their hands is not waste, but a byproduct that has value, so it can be reintegrated into the production chain.
This floating barrier in Panama regularly stops around 30 tons of garbage from flowing into the ocean.
We'd love to put one underneath it as well, because a lot of the garbage floats either at the surface or below. But to put something underneath the system would potentially trap not only the garbage, but animals as well, crocodiles, turtles, fish.
The local community says the authorities should take tangible measures. Chile and Panama both have approved a ban on single-use plastic bags. By next year, people using plastic bags will be fined. But it's still an uphill battle, as throwing trash in the street is still culturally acceptable.
As the world makes headway in the battle against HIV, Morocco has also shown some progress. For people infected with the disease, there remains a heavy stigma. More in this report.
In Casablanca, a group therapy workshop offers HIV patients a rare opportunity to speak openly about their disease. The ALCS also organises follow-up therapeutic care and screening campaigns with funding from the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. But despite this, some groups remain vulnerable.
What allows us to decrease infection rates is largely due to our work with the most exposed populations. And we have a lot of apprehension about the sustainability of the financing of this work if the Global Fund were to quit Morocco.
In this conservative society, HIV patients seldom talk publicly about the virus. The shame of the disease is so entrenched, it even permeates the medical establishment.
Moroccan society is a society without any mercy, not necessarily with your family and friends, but the whole society. There are educated people and others who are not.
With funding declining globally and controversy surrounding the management of UNAIDS, ALCS fears financial cuts. Morocco's fate will be determined at a 3-yearly conference for the Global Fund in October.
In business stories, European markets have opened higher with optimism over the state of US-China trade relations. Despite this, gains remains capped by escalating political uncertainty in the US. The pan-European stock 600 rose in early trade. Britain's FTSE 100 led the upward momentum, hitting its highest since last month. Frankfurt's DAX 30 and Paris CAC 40 have also soared. Meanwhile, gold prices remain steady. Investors' focus is largely turned to political developments in the US. Now let's have a look at the weather updates across the world. With the weather update, we come to the end of this bulletin. For more news and updates, keep watching Indus News.